Alright, so we're going to try out this lighting for this video. Hi, welcome back to the channel. Let's do a sort of almost late, kind of late, almost a week late, whatever. It's here now. My April wrap up. Let's talk about the books that I read. First up, and this is actually not the first book that I read, it was the last book that I read in the month of April, is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. So this is the history of the Targaryens set roughly 200 years before the beginning of A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, this is very much a history book, and that's the way it's written. This is not a narrative / character-driven book necessarily. There are parts of it that certainly are, but this is, for the most part, a history text. This is just documenting different reigns of the Targaryens from Aegon the Conqueror all the way up to just before the beginning of A Song of Ice and Fire. So you've got several Targaryen kings, Maegor, Jaehaerys, Aegon II, III. There's all kinds that you get lots and lots of details on. The Dance of the Dragons, the Dying of the Dragons. You get a lot of details into the beginnings of the conquering of Westeros with Aegon I, the uniting of the Seven Kingdoms, even though Dorne does not play nice. They kind of kick the shit out of the Targaryens for a long time, and they don't bend the knee to them. You already understand that a lot of Westeros is warring with each other anyway. A lot of familiar names, Starks, Lannisters, etc., are all, vying for power. But what was really cool is at the beginning is actually getting to see some of the construction of King's Landing and the Red Keep, and just the expansion of it, and the creation of the Iron Throne, which is way more badass in the books than it was in the show, where it's really just a chair with some spikes. The Iron Throne, if you've never seen book text pictures of it, it looks like this. And that is because Aegon the Conqueror used the swords of his enemies that he defeated in battle to create this gigantic tower of a seat to sit on. It's meant to be uncomfortable. It's meant to cut you. It's meant to be intimidating and imposing, and it's just the most badass way to flex. There are parts of this that seem kind of dry. There's definitely chapters that are more interesting than others. The whole Jaehaerys reign is probably the most interesting outside of Aegon's conquest. Maegor is really cool to learn about because he's just a gigantic piece of shit. But largely, because this isn't a narrative-driven novel, I could definitely see this not being for everyone. If you love A Song of Ice and Fire, you love learning more about fake history of this world, it is really, really interesting. And I know Jimmy and Leanna actually enjoyed it more than I did. I didn't dislike it by any means, but it is missing something for me to really latch onto, which is usually characters, plot, things like that. So I'm not much of a history book reader, but it is cool because I love the world so much. I love the lore. I'm kind of back and forth on how much I enjoyed it. I definitely didn't love it, but I did enjoy it a lot. I think I enjoyed it a lot more because I got to talk to my friends about it, which of course we did in another live stream, which was the conclusion of our read-along, so that will be linked in the description down below. We talked again for several hours on this book and just the series as a whole. It will be really cool to see what they actually adapt for House of the Dragon, coming to HBO August, something like that. So it'll be cool to see, one, exactly what they adapt and how far they take it, and two, if it does really well, let's see if they come back to this one for more, and let's see if that pushes George to write Fire and Blood Part 2, which I know is planned. Hopefully he does wins first, but we'll see. I did enjoy it. I think you will too if you are just a huge lover of this world and you want to know more about it and know more about everything that led up to A Song of Ice and Fire. Next up, and this was actually the first thing that I read, was The Lies of Lokmora, which is fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Scott Lynch, for writing this book. It was fantastic. I had been recommended this repeatedly for probably the last year. People really thinking that I would love it. And go figure, y'all right, I did love it. Especially Jake, constantly telling me in Discord and trying to vote for it for Patreon picks, saying that I would love it. You're right, I did. This book is fantastic, and even if I never got another continuation of this, because I know there's 2 other books of a potential 7, so this series, again, much like A Song of Ice and Fire, may never be completed, but I think Lies of Lokmora, and I'll get to this in my actual review of it later in the next week or so, it functions really well as a standalone. The way that this wraps up, you could absolutely just end it there, and it would be a perfectly great fantasy adventure with, you know, the potential for more to happen, but it's not so much of a cliffhanger ending that you're like, oh my God, like the next novel needs to be here right now. Like I have to see what happened. It's wrapped up in such a good way that it could really just end, and that would be that, and it would be perfect, and you wouldn't need to touch it. The character work here is fantastic. Locke and Jean are really just interesting, witty, and fun to follow. There's a ton of other characters as well that you interact with throughout this novel, amidst all their hijinks and the many lies that they tell and the faces that they wear and the personas that they take on. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of just hilarious dialogue, lots of swearing, all the stuff that I like to read. The back and forth dynamic between the characters is great. The way that the story kicks off is excellent. Basically, Locke being pawned off on somebody and saying, hey, if you don't buy this kid, like, I'm going to cut his throat. But it's one of those stories that it doesn't need a ton of action to be gripping and keep your audience, because through the dialogue and the scenarios that the characters are in, it's just so much fun to read. And there is combat, but it's very, very minimal. It's much more focused on the character and the story, and it's not like a big epic battle scene is really happening. It's almost like a heist novel in a lot of ways. There's a lot of thievery. There's just a lot of like scheming and almost like Mission Impossible kind of things happening. And it's just a good time. I'm definitely eager to continue and see where the story goes from where we left off and see how much it does expand, because I imagine if it's going to 7 novels, it's going to be much like other fantasy stories, where it starts off a little bit of a smaller scale and grows into a much larger thing, like the Dresden Files, you know, very much a noir at the beginning, and then it's full-blown epic fantasy. So I'm curious to see if that's what Scott Lynch has planned for this. Hopefully we do get the rest of the books, but again, if we don't, it seems like these books are going to be right up my alley and definitely great on their own, even if you don't get the rest. So highly recommend Lies of Lokmora. Full review coming soon. The next ones on here, of course, are Kingdoms of Death and The Lesser Devil and Other Stories by Christopher Rocchio. Now, I have already read The Lesser Devil. Leon and I talked about that in one of our live chats, either for Demon in White or Howling Dark. I forget which one, but that is the first half of this bind up of all of the short stories. And then the other one is if you've ever seen Tales of the Sun Eater, Volume 1, because he is working on Volume 2 and probably many others. That's a collection of short stories that makes up the second half of this bind up. So Demons of RA to whatever else there is. It's basically short stories following the Red Company, which if you know anything about these books, the Red Company is Hadrian, our main character. It's his crew. And the short stories take place obviously in between books. So you probably want to follow along with the series before you read most of these, because they could potentially spoil other books. I'm sure he's talked about where and when you should read them. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in here. So there's a lot. It's about 200 or so pages of short stories in the back after The Lesser Devil, because that's the biggest one. But this is book 5. No, that's wrong. This is book 4. Book 5 comes out later this year because he had to actually split book 4 into 2. So now we get 2 Sun Eater books in 2022, which is fantastic. This is definitely one of the darker ones of this series, certainly. I was hearing a lot of comparisons to Dark Age by Pierce Brown, which is book 5 of Red Rising. Personally, I think Dark Age is a lot darker and more depressing. People keep telling me there's glimmers of hope in that book, but I mean, did y'all read the book? There's not that much hope. Kingdoms of Death, though, really breaks Hadrian down. I'm not going to get into any spoilers here, but this is aptly named. There is a lot of death in this book. There is a lot of despair, and while we do know that he eventually, succeeds because he's the one telling you the story, man, the shit that he goes through in this book and his crew and humanity as a whole, just wow. I wasn't really expecting it. There is a lot. It's not a happy book, certainly. It's, of course, well written, wonderfully done. I love Christopher Rocchio's prose. I love his plotting. The majority of his character work is outstanding. I feel like the side characters, at least personally for me, aren't great in the series. A couple of them stand out, obviously, above the others, but in general, This is really about Hadrian and Valka. The majority of the other characters are hit or miss for me, and I think having the other stories certainly helps there, because that does build their characters up even more so than you would get strictly just reading the main novel. So I do recommend reading those. I don't think they're as good as the main novels by any mean. I mean, they're novellas, they're, you know, side stories, so I don't think they're meant to be. They always feel a little bit different or slightly, you know, less eventful, but they're really well done, and probably some of the better short stories that I've read in general. I think that's also just because I love the main novel so much that any additional info is just awesome to have. But this book, it's a little bit slower at times, certainly, and the big epic moments are a little bit more spaced out than I would say some of the other previous books. But having said that, though, I was never really bored in this book. There's, even at the slowest moments of it, I'm very invested and interested in this story, even when there's lengthy amounts of terrible, terrible things happening to our main character and everyone around him. It's just so well done, and it gets pretty violent and awful for a lot of them, but it's so cool. I absolutely love this space opera take that Chris Arracchio is doing. I think he is, I mean, granted, I haven't read too much sci-fi, but as far as like space operas go and just epic tales that I've read, this is definitely up there. It's one of my favorite ongoing series for sure. And I can't wait to see where it goes from here, because obviously, again, from the get-go in Empire of Silence, you know the quote-unquote ending, or where our main character ends up, but everything in between is so interesting, and the fact that he keeps taking it in directions that I wasn't expecting. There's tons of twists and turns that I never anticipated. You learn so much more about the Cielson and humanity and just everything that's going on in this world. It keeps evolving, and it's always interesting. There's really never a dull moment for me in these books, and I love them. I will have a full spoiler-filled discussion with Leanna on Friday of this week, so on 5/6. Yeah, May 6th. And it's, I don't know, it's up there, man. These books are awesome. So that's everything that I read last month. I'm certainly reading less these days just because of being busy with work and kids and gaming quite a bit. So it's probably going to be about 3 to 4 books a month. That's going to be my average between audiobooks and reading. That's just where I'm going to stick to. That's what I read in the month of April. What did you read? Have you read any of these? Anyone stand out as something that you're interested in? Maybe let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, keep reading.